Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to our session, Solar Radiation Modification, Governance Challenges and Options Considering the Interests of Countries Most Vulnerable to Climate Change. I'm Siraza Munira, Program Officer for the Climate Vulnerable Forum from the Global Center on Adaptation, welcoming you all to our session. This is being organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, CVF. The Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, is an independent initiative whose mission is to catalyze the creation or strengthening of governance frameworks for climate-altering approaches, in particular of solar radiation modification and large-scale carbon dioxide removal. On the other hand, the Climate Vulnerable Forum is an international partnership of countries highly vulnerable to a warming planet. The forum serves as a South-South cooperation platform for participating governments to act together to deal with the global climate change. The 48 members of the forum span over Asia, Africa, the Pacific, and Latin America. The two lead organizations which are in joint participation with which we are actually organizing this session are C2G and CVF. When I last left, I had been describing what briefly these organizations are doing. The session is based on the solar radiation modification SRM as a potential additional approach to supplement emissions reduction and carbon removal efforts to keep the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5 degrees. Although SRM approaches include ideas to inject aerosols into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight to directly cool the planet, making marine clouds more reflective using seawater particles, defrosting, and other approaches. This session will particularly be focused on the approach to SRM, Stratospheric Aerosol Injection. Now I'll move on to the session description. The session will start with two keynote speeches on the perspective of countries highly vulnerable to climate change and on governance challenges and developments relating to solar radiation modification. These will be followed by a panel discussion to explore the key interest areas, knowledge priorities, and engagement pathways on SRM and SAI for countries most vulnerable to climate change. To begin the session, may I please welcome Professor Dr. Saleemul, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development and Chair of the Expert Advisory Group of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, for his opening remarks. Dr. Haq, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, and good afternoon from Dhaka. Good morning and good evening to those of you in different time zones. Let me welcome you to this session. I'll start. My name is Saleemul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, also the organizers of this Gobeshona conference, which I'll talk a little bit about. And I'm also the chair of the Expert Advisory Group of the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries, of which one of our other experts, Red Constantino, will be moderating this discussion. Let me start by saying a little bit about the conference that we are one of the sessions of, and then I'll speak a little bit about the topic that this particular session is going to be addressing. So to give you a little bit of a history, the word Gobeshona, let me start with that for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a Bangla word for research. And it is the word we use for a platform of primarily Bangladeshi research institutes and universities that we set up 7 years ago to bring together people who are doing research on different aspects of climate change. We have a website with well over 2,000 publications in our archived searchable database. We do monthly seminars of the researchers doing research. And then we've been doing a big annual conference every year, in January every year for the last 6 years or 7 years. And the last 6 of them, the first 6 conferences, we've done as an in-person conference in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Several hundred people over 4 days in a traditional conference setting at our university in Dhaka. Mostly Bangladeshi participants, but we also got a fair number of international participants. And for the last several years, we have had sessions on SRM, on solar radiation management. We've had international speakers come and talk about it. So we're very pleased that this year we also have, not just this session, we actually have more than one session on solar radiation management, and I'd recommend people to attend that if they can. The conference this year is different from previous years. Firstly, obviously, it is an online conference rather than an in-person conference. But as we decided to go virtual and online, we decided to also make the leap from being primarily Bangladesh focused to becoming global. And the theme that we have chosen to work on globally is locally led adaptation, working with the most vulnerable communities everywhere in the world. And we invited our partners and friends around the world to offer to do sessions on what they were doing relevant for this topic. And we were overwhelmed with responses. In fact, we got so many responses that we expanded it to 7 days. And we are running sessions 24 hours a day for 7 days. So it's a 24/7. We have more than 90 sessions across these. We are now in the third day. We've done two 24-hour cycles in 8-hour segments. First 8 hours for the Asia Pacific region, second 8 hours for the Africa Europe region, and the third 8 hours for the Americas region, and we've done 2 cycles of 24 hours already, and we are now in our third day. So it's working very well so far. We've been connecting people from all over the world, and we have decided to keep this virtual format going forward. So from now on, every year in January, we will have this Gaveshana conference. We will over 7 days, 24 hours over 7 days, and we will invite everybody to come back and take stock about what has happened in between. And so what we are calling this particular conference is a rebranding. It's the 7th conference of the old series, but we are rebranding it as the first conference of the new global series. And we are starting what we are calling a 10-year journey from this year, 2021. And we invite everybody to come back every year and tell us what they've been doing and how we've been making progress, if at all, and take that forward over the next 10 years to reach our destination in 2030, which, as you all know, is the destination year for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and also the 2 Paris Agreement goals of mitigation and adaptation. So that's a sort of framing of this Gaveshana conference as a whole. This particular session is one of a series we've had before. And I'm very pleased that we are partnering up with Janos and his team to do this session. So before I hand over to Janos, let me say a few words about where we come from in this issue. First of all, where we come from is to recognize that climate change is happening. In fact, I contend that the year 2020 that just passed will not only be remembered as the year of the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously it will be, but also the year that we have actually transitioned from a pre-climate change world into a post-climate change world. 2020 was very attributably and visibly the year in which climate change, human-induced climate change, because of the temperature increase by over 1 degree centigrade, attributable to human greenhouse gases, has happened. And from now on, we will not just call a year the warmest year, as 2020 was just declared. We will think of it as the coolest year of the future. In 2021, we will think of this year as last year as the cool year, and then ever onwards, getting warmer and warmer. And so we are now truly in a new world. And despite the good news that we hope will happen in a few hours' time in Washington with President-elect Biden getting sworn in, and one of his first acts, he has already said he's going to sign the executive order to get the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement. Very good news. He's appointed some very, very good senior people, both on the domestic climate front and the international climate front, particularly former Secretary of State John Kerry, who negotiated the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. All good signs, but nevertheless, we lost 4 years under Trump. So the climate change has been happening. It's not stood still. Biden is not coming back to when Obama left. He's coming back to a much worse situation, and simply doing something better than Trump is not going to be enough. We are in quite bad situation. And so in that circumstance, although we need every country to enhance their ambition to reduce their emissions so that we can bring temperatures below 2 degrees, and if possible, and I believe it's still possible, but it's going to be very difficult, to 1.5 degrees, nevertheless, other options like solar radiation management and other kinds of geoengineering ideas are being floated. And they are serious ideas that we need to be taking stock of. So in my institute in ICAD in Bangladesh, we take a watching brief. We are not experts in the field. We don't take a stand on it, but we have two very strong views. The first one is that we need to know more about it. So we want to learn. And we invite experts to teach us and tell us about the different nuances and the different things that are possible and the pros and cons of each of them. So we are in a learning mode. And secondly, we have a very strong view that no decisions can be taken without the views of the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable communities taken into account. And that is really the constituency that we represent in this particular conference. Locally led adaptation focuses on the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries. Not that the vulnerable communities have to understand what SRM is, but we, as the sort of catalytic researchers and academic community, need to understand it, and then on their behalf articulate views on whether we like something or we don't like something. And one of the biggest fears that we have is that things might happen without our consent or even without our consultation. And that should not be. It might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, but it cannot happen without the rest of the world having a say in whether or not it should go ahead. And so we are very interested in learning about it as a technical level, and also very interested in ensuring that the governance structures for unleashing new technologies, if we decide to do that, are such that the most vulnerable have a say and a voice in that. So I'll stop there, hand over to Sylvie to go forward. But let me again welcome everybody to this session, to the Gopeshana Conference. If you've not registered for other sessions, I recommend that you do that. We have a good 40 or 50 sessions still to come over the next 4 days. I recommend people pick a session. It's very easy. You register and pick a session to join. They're all online and they're all free. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Huck, for your valuable speech and remarks, and for that really optimistic note. Definitely considering this year as the coolest year going forward, hoping for the best as we go ahead. Thank you so much again. Ladies and gentlemen, now may I please request and welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Janos Pasztor, Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, to share his remarks on the challenges and opportunities on the governance of solar radiation management. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends and colleagues. Indeed, I would like to share a few thoughts about solar radiation modification, why we need to even think about it, and what are some of the key governance challenges that we are facing. But before that, I just wanted to say thank you to Saleem for the introductory remarks, and I think this is very exciting what you just described, this 10-year project. It's funny because I've just been asked by somebody to write down some reflection on what I would think 10 years from now and look back. So this is like working at it from both ways. So I look forward personally, but also we as C2G, we look forward to continuing to engage with you on this exercise. Now, in terms of just a few words about C2G, just so that it's clear that where the ideas are coming from. So the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative was set up as an entity to look into and try to advance thinking and contribute to the development of governance frameworks of these emerging climate-altering technologies like carbon dioxide removal on the one hand and solar radiation modification on the other. We will be talking about the latter at this session only. What is important to mention here is that our impartiality about the use or not of these techniques. So we're not here to promote, we're not here to be against. That's not our purpose. Our purpose, as very much as Saleem put it, is it could be good, it could be bad, but we need to encourage the discussion, the consideration, so that eventually when decisions are made for or against, they're made properly based on evidence and based on wide consultation. So that's our essence at C2G. In terms of the background, so we've heard from Saleem, and I totally support his views that we are in a serious crisis situation. We've just had the hottest year, and it's been hot the last few years. And while there is some progress, there is not enough progress. The emissions are not yet going down. There are some nice commitments that countries are making and so on, and that's helpful perhaps if they're implemented. But the reality is that the world is still heading to a 3 to 4 degree centigrade warming above the historical average, unless certain actions are actually seriously taken. Now, in that kind of a situation, the reality is that emission reductions alone are unlikely to be sufficient to maintain the Paris goal of keeping temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. The IPCC was very clear in its special report on 1.5 and in earlier reports that substantial amount of carbon dioxide removal will be needed in order to reach those goals. So already that. And then there are a number of scientists who are saying that the world may need to go beyond that, and we may need to apply these emerging solar radiation modification ideas. The IPCC is less clear about this. We hope to get some more new information from the sixth assessment report that is now being prepared. But at this point in time, we need to think of this as a potential that may or may not be needed. Now, the reality is that, as we also heard from Saleem, is that the climate tends to impact most the vulnerable countries, mostly in the global south, the small island countries, the most obvious ones where it's a question of existential threat of actually islands disappearing, but also generally vulnerability is a function of many factors, including economic development, geographic, climatic factors, and that brings a lot of the countries from the global south into what you could call vulnerable countries. And the impacts of climate change will be most evident on those countries. And equally, if solar radiation modification were to be used, the potential benefits, but also the risks would be most evident in those countries. Now, what I'd like to do now is just to talk a little bit about some of the solar radiation modification options, then the general governance issues, and then specifically a few governance issues that relate to the global south. Before doing that, just a few words about terminology. So I use the word solar radiation modification, which is the IPCC's preferred terminology. That's what we use in C2G. Some call this solar geoengineering, some call this climate engineering. So there are different words, different phrases to describe these. We decided that the best is to follow the IPCC's approach in this. Now, Saleem, you talked about the locally based adaptation as the focus. This is probably the opposite. But at the same time, if it were ever to be used, it will have substantial impacts on locally based adaptation. It might have to adjust them. So I think it is certainly worth talking about these techniques in the context of a conference that is focused on locally based adaptation. Now, there are three main types of SRM, solar radiation modification, that one can discuss. The first is actually local radiation modification. That would be at the ground level, painting roofs white or changing plants that have different albedo, different reflectivity to change the reflectivity of sunlight. We are not going to talk about that here at all, and those tend to have more local as opposed to global climate implications. The second one Sylvie already alluded to that, the marine cloud brightening. Again, I will mention it briefly here. It's about spraying seawater into the sky to make more clouds, which would then reflect sunlight back into space. This would be essentially a regional approach, but it could have global implications in terms of the climate if sufficiently large regional activities are put in place. There were some recent experiments in Australia and others are being planned elsewhere, but I will not talk more about that now. The most talked about method or approach here is the stratospheric aerosol injection, the idea of spraying some materials, sulfur aerosols or carbonates or other materials into the stratosphere that would then reflect more sunlight back into space, thereby cooling the planet. Now, we have to be absolutely clear from the beginning, this is not an alternative, a substitute to emission reductions, because it doesn't solve the problem. It only addresses the impact. So it's not a question of doing emission reductions or SRM, but is doing emission reductions and maybe in addition to that, other things like carbon removal and potentially solar radiation modification. There are natural analogs. The volcanic eruption does the same thing. And it has been measured that major volcanic eruptions cool the planet for a certain period of time. It's the same physical concept. One interesting challenge with solar radiation modification is that it is likely, stratospheric aerosol injection in particular, that it is likely to be quite cheap, in inverted commas. It seems that one could do a global stratospheric aerosol injection project for a few $1 billion a year, which is really quite small amount. But it's a problem. Sometimes it's a problem when something is too cheap because it removes or lowers the barrier for entry. And it is conceivable for a single country or even a non-state actor to engage in this kind of technology. Now, there will be, of course, impacts. And the first big one is, of course, a reduction in temperature. That's why one would want to potentially do SRM. So the most important impact is a positive one of temperature reduction. It must be mentioned here that while the temperature could be reduced back to what it was before, the climate cannot be brought back the same way. So that's an important concept. But of course, there will be lots of negative impacts, some which are known, some which are unknown, including changes to the local climates. And of course, we are manipulating we would be manipulating the one global atmosphere that we have. There would be issues of precipitation changes, potential impacts on the ozone layer, depending on what kind of materials we use. Then the sunlight would change, the color of the sunlight would change and its intensity. And then there are geopolitical and security implications of, especially if there are unilateral actions, if one country does it and others are not particularly happy about it, because the effect would be global in any case. So there are many issues, but of course these issues, one has to compare the potential impacts not against the world of today, but against the world of 3 to 4 degrees above where we are today. The reason why anybody ever would want to do solar radiation modification. Now, what is actually the global status today? No country is openly pursuing this option. There is quite a bit of research going on. Some people say not as much as necessary, but there is research, mostly in terms of modeling and thinking in the US, in China, in some European countries. And now through a very interesting initiative by the SRMGI, the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, where through the Decimals Fund, some research is beginning to take place in developing countries as well. There are some in situ experiments that are being planned, in particular by the Harvard group. And there was one in the UK a few years ago, the SPICE experiment, that was aborted for various reasons. We don't have time to go into that right now. Globally, I think it's fair to say that there is great hesitancy about stratospheric aerosol injection, but there is also strong interest to learn and understand how it works, what are the risks and benefits, very much along the lines of what Saleem said at the beginning. People want to know, people want to understand. That has been our experience working with governments and non-state actors. Now, the key governance challenges, issues, first, in general, I think it's important to be clear at the beginning what we mean by governance, because very often people think of governance as action by government to regulate. And yes, that is included in governance, but we look at governance in a broader way. Again, the IPCC does that also, to look at this as a broad framework where different stakeholders are engaged, they have access to information for effective participation, they participate in making choices about technologies, about systems, and so on. And then eventually it also includes government regulations as needed. So it is that broader action involving different stakeholders. The first governance issues that relate to this is the governance of research itself. And some really interesting developments are taking place right now in relation to the Harvard experiment of how one should control or govern the actual experimentation. One needs guardrails for these experiments of where they can go, where they cannot go, or how they should do certain experiments. But also, on the other hand, one is to limit, to control, to guard within boundaries. But also, it's a question of governance can also be there to encourage, to provide public policy guidelines on the directions that research should take place. There was a good example of this in the Convention of Biological Diversity, which in the 2016 COP, they actually requested more transdisciplinary research in this area to have better understanding. So that's the governance of research itself. But then there is the most difficult governance challenge of making choices about stratospheric aerosol injection. Because however one does it, the effect will be global. Everybody will be affected one way or another, whether it's done through unilateral action or some globally agreed action, it will still be have global impact. So one needs to have some level of global engagement. And where to start? There is no obvious location, international process or institution where this discussion, this consideration could take place. There are places where one can learn about this, and certainly the IPCC is one, in order to advance the understanding, the assessing the current scientific knowledge. The UN Environment Assembly, there has been some developments there already. And eventually the UN General Assembly can be perhaps locations where one can learn, one can understand better what these issues are. But then, even if somehow the international community were able to come to some conclusion on whether or not to actually undertake such technologies and deploy them, there are a host of governance issues related to the actual deployment. Who will do the deployment? On whose behalf? Who will guide that entity? Who will control the global thermostat? Whether you reduce the temperature by 1 degree or 2 or 3. And these things make a difference because according to the models, if the temperature reduction is relatively low, then the impacts will be pretty much equal globally. But the more you turn the thermostat to higher temperature reductions, the more unequal impacts appear. And then if there are unequal impacts, then some people will be better off, some people will be worse off. And again, that needs to be addressed one way or another. Another important consideration in the governance of this approach is that one has to put in place a system that will deliver on an ongoing basis solar radiation modification for decades, literally decades to come, and undisturbed, because once you get it going, you can't stop it until the global concentrations have come down sufficiently that you can do that, to avoid what is called the termination shock. Because if you suddenly stop solar radiation modification and you haven't reduced carbon concentrations, then suddenly the temperature will go up, and that could be even worse than the slow increase in temperature. So there are quite a few interesting challenges there. And then I add one thing here, that we live in a not so perfect world. And in this not so perfect world, one can expect all kinds of strange developments. And one thing is to think of solar radiation modification as a structured international agreement, even if it's done unilaterally by one country. But imagine civil society organizations across the world, strengthened through social media, putting the situation into their own hands and releasing balloons of aerosols that go up into the stratosphere. And how do you govern that? These are possibilities, and one has to think about how to address them. And then, if the choice is to not make use of this technology, then there are a host of implications of the non-deployment. And how does one deal with that? Because if it's a 3 to 4 degree world and the emissions are not coming down, then it will have a huge impact on adaptation. It will have a huge impact on many, many other issues. And then finally, I'd just like to raise a few specific issues that I think are relevant to the Global South, and they are not different than what Saleem mentioned at the beginning, but we'll just go a little bit more into the details. So right now, the reality is that the Global South has had relatively low engagement in the governance discussions. And again, governance is this broader framework. And yet, the Global South has the most to gain from the use of SRM, and potentially also the most to lose because of its vulnerability. If there are, depending on the different scenarios, one can have very uneven climate response across different regions. And it seems from the models that very often it's actually the Global South that would end up with worse impacts. So how does one deal with that? For example, the precipitation effects could be riskier in many of the Global South countries because of the already existing vulnerabilities. Now, I already mentioned the SRMGI. That's been a very useful development because it's beginning to build the capacity in the Global South of researchers who are undertaking specific research in view of the Global South issues. And that helps also in informing the policy people in those countries about what those are. But still, overall, not enough academic or policy work is taking place in the Global South, and it would be helpful if that could change. It's not so much necessarily because one says that SRM is going to be needed, but it is important to understand for the Global South, if somebody else does that, what will be the impacts on the Global South and how the Global South should then deal with that. And I think some of the decimals funded projects are beginning to go into that direction, and that's really great. One interesting note is that some of the research that is coming out, it seems to, from the Global South, it seems to be indicating that there are more positive impacts of stratospheric aerosol injection than the potential negative ones. Now, I don't know how that's going to look in the future, but at least that is what we are seeing for now. And we can go into the examples, but I won't now because of shortage of time. So there are a number of fora where potential discussions are taking place, and I think this is where the Global South can begin to act in a more substantial way. Certainly the IPCC, the UN Environment Assembly, both the fifth session and the fifth session BIS in 2022. There is a question whether the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is a place to discuss SRM. I think there is a debate about that, to be fair, but I would say most people believe that it is not the most appropriate and practical place to do so. So, in conclusion, the SRM and particularly the Stratospheric Aerosol Injection is there on the radar screen, and it's not going to go away by not dealing with it. Experiments are on the way. Some countries are developing. Some already have a national research program of one kind or another. So we need to deal with it. And at some point in the future, one will need to decide whether or not this is an option that one wants to consider. And in that process of making those choices, conscious of the risks and the benefits and the potential benefits, the involvement of the Global South is essential. And I very much hope that this session today is one small contribution to that effort. So with that, thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion in the panel.
Thank you, Janos, for your keynote speech and sharing the essence of C2G and its approach towards SRM through an evidence-based and consultative manner. As you rightly said, we do hope with ongoing research we someday get the answer to actually who controls the global thermostat, but I believe that will engage more intensive trials to address other questions. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, now may I request Mr. Red Constantino, Deputy Co-Chair of the CVF Expert Advisory Group and Executive Director of the International Institute for the Climate and Sustainable Cities, to kindly facilitate the panel discussion. The panel discussion will be followed by a Q&A round. But before I pass it to Red, I want to thank all the colleagues from CVF, C2G, and ICAD who are working behind the screens and who have truly helped us to make this event happen. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us all this time. Red, over to you.
Sylvie, thank you very much. Thank you as well to C2G and CVF for having me here. As Sylvie had mentioned, and as Saleem had also said earlier, I'm the Deputy Co-Chair of the Expert Advisors Group, which my dear colleague, Dr. Saleem Haq, chairs. It's my pleasure to actually moderate this panel of distinguished people who I hope will be sharing a lot more insights, a lot more questions, and a lot more angles that I think have not been explored as much. We will I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves very briefly because we'd like to reserve far more time for interaction among the panelists, but also the participants, because this is a special session. As Saleem and Janos had said earlier before me, this topic is a critical one to put on the table and discuss at length and in detail. We've heard a number of times just from our two previous speakers, and if you've been paying attention to the climate debate, the subject of solar radiation modification and geoengineering in general has occupied more and more space in a lot of debates around the world, especially more intensely over the last few years. And a large part of it deals with benefits that are touted to come the way of developing countries, in particular vulnerable countries. And at CVF, we do distinguish Global South by saying that we need to focus on vulnerable countries in particular. But we also talk about a lot, and the debate is also framed a lot by the potential risks and dangers. Let me start by saying something that's quite clear, that whatever threats that geoengineering or SRM poses, as raised by many think tanks and academics and engineers and government officials, I think the biggest threat is that the vulnerable countries are out of this discussion, and that this comes too late to their plates. The biggest threat is that the ones who are going to receive and are already receiving most of the dire impacts of climate change are also late in terms of being consulted, but also in sharing their views as well. So I'm very thankful that this conference has allowed us to have this collaboration between C2G and CVF to shed more light on such an important topic, and that we can actually accelerate the sharing of insights from vulnerable country perspectives. In particular, because it's a loaded discussion, it's a loaded debate. Just in the last few minutes, we've already used words that I think bear a lot of weight in terms of the different ways that we look at it. Janos was correct, I think, to distinguish why we shouldn't just simply use terms and loosely without defining what they actually are. And he has been of the view that it's better to use the IPCC definition and to exercise caution in using the term geoengineering because it encompasses far more issues. There's also another side that says you have to name it, you have to use it, you have to keep repeating geoengineering because otherwise we may end up reducing potentially the risks that many are confronting. I'd like to add as well some of the words that were used that I think bear a lot of burden in terms of shedding the different ways that vulnerable countries will define this. When we hear the word cheap, what is cheap? Because what might be cheap in terms of gate price, for instance, will probably be more expensive by experience when the impacts start coming our way that were not really projected. When we talk about impacts, the impacts on the global north are pretty much very different from the impacts on the global south. And we need a way to distill what is actually relevant, especially for vulnerable communities. When we speak about the solutions or the benefits of solar radiation modification to the global south and what benefits it might bring, and oftentimes you hear the word we need to ask the question, who is we? And also why vulnerable countries are only now being part of the discussion. When we talk about the word research, such a neutral sounding term, in the experience and history of the global south, in particular vulnerable countries, research means a lot of different things as well. And oftentimes, from experience as well, when the ones that are most vulnerable come late to the discussion, they often hear approaches that say, it's already here anyway, so might as well deal with it because it's not going to go away. It's not really a good place to start. However, this session, I hope, can help start correcting that imbalance by getting the views from some of the most important people that can shed light on this discussion. I would ask each one to introduce themselves briefly because you'll have more time to talk about your work and your views as well when it's your turn to speak. But namely, I'll be asking our panelists, Leah, Ambuj, Mofiz, Emmanuel, and Mark, to briefly give us your full name, where you're from, institution where that you work with, and what exactly you do in a very brief way. Leah, maybe you can start with you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Wanambwa. I'm from Kenya. I'm working at the African Union Commission, and I'm a senior policy officer working on climate change. I guess this is it for now.
Thank you very much, Leah. Ambuj D. Sagar, a little bit more about yourself, please, before it comes your turn.
Sure. I'm Ambuj Sagar. I'm an academic teaching at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. And I head the School of Public Policy here. And my personal research interest focuses on policy issues that lie at the interface of science and technology and sustainable development.
Thank you, Ambuj. May I ask our colleague Mofiz Rahman, a scientist based in Germany currently, to introduce himself a little bit more. Mofiz, you have the floor.
Hi, this is Muhammad Rahman. I'm from Bangladesh, and currently I'm based in Cologne, Germany. I'm working here in an institute called Cologne University for Applied Sciences as a research associate. But I'm here as a Alexander von Humboldt Climate Protection Fellow. But beside that, we have started a program in India in Anand National University. It's called Anand Fellowship for Climate Action. So that's our version of making climate leaders in India. So I work in both the places. And in addition to that, I will describe a little more in my part of talk that we are one of the first decimal grant winner in Bangladesh, looking at potential health risk of SRM,
Okay.
which Jan Pasztor has mentioned briefly. Yeah, thank you.
Mofiz, thank you very much. We go now to our distinguished colleague from Ghana, Emmanuel, please.
Yeah, thank you, Red. Chair, honorable members of panel, facilitators, distinguished participants. My name is Dr. Manuel Titiabi. I'm a Deputy Director of Climate Change in Environmental Protection Agency, Ghana, and I'm a Fellow of Global Center for Adaptation that is based in Netherlands. As already said, I'm joining you live from Ghana. Actually, I'm not a solar radiation modification expert, but I'm here to share experience as a climate specialist from one of the vulnerable countries of CVF in terms of interest of the topic, related policies and recommendations, the governing practices and technologies of climate change of our member countries. Thank you.
Emmanuel, thank you very much. And last but not the least, for the short introduction, a visiting fellow at the Cornell Alliance for Science, Mark. Briefly.
Thanks, Red, and thank you very much. And hello, everyone. So my name's Mark Helinas. I'm an environmentalist, campaigner, and popular science writer. My most recent book is called Our Final Warning: 6 Degrees of a Climate Emergency. As Red just mentioned, I'm also a visiting fellow at the Cornell Alliance for Science, and we do kind of pro-science campaignings against anti-science misinformation around the world on numerous different issues. And I'm also advisor to President Nasheed of the Maldives, former President Nasheed of the Maldives, in his capacity as Ambition Ambassador at the Climate Vulnerable Forum. So that's mainly the hat I think I'm wearing today.
Thank you, Mark. You wear several hats, but thank you for being brief as well. So, colleagues, let's dive straight into our discussion. I guess the big question is how vulnerable countries might approach the governance of solar radiation modification, and how will this really address associated risks and potential benefits in the context of a warming world. We're lucky to have Leah to help kick off this discussion. Leah, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And I'll just go back to the institution that I work with, and that is the African Union Commission. Our headquarters are in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So most of the work that we do is around policy, advocacy, and harmonization. And so in this case, on climate change. So we do this through a three-tier process, which we involve the experts, and these experts are drawn from the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change. And this works with the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, which is at a ministerial level. In short, we call it AMCEN. And then this feeds back to the Committee of African Heads of States and Government on Climate Change, CAHOSC. So CAHOSC usually meets around now in February on the margins of the AU Assembly. And the AGN, of course, meets constantly during the climate negotiations. And AMCEN meets normally on the margins of the climate COP, just before the high-level segment. So these three bodies are kind of responsible for ensuring that Africa is well represented and our African interests are taken care of in the climate negotiations. So that is on that level. And on policy harmonization, currently for now, we are working on a continental strategy for climate change. The process started a few years ago, but of course, it's not always easy to get buy-in from all the 55 member states. So it has taken a bit of time, but now we are back and trying to now, in light of the new agreements and circumstances, to develop our continental strategy. So what is the current scenario in terms of governance on the SRM? So of course, we as Africa is one of the most countries in Africa are among the most vulnerable when it comes to issues of climate change. So of course, any solution that will be found would be good if it leads to a reduction in the temperatures. However, as we know very well, the commitments which we made in Paris are not going to take us to the desired goal that I think has already been mentioned earlier. And so, of course, we need to do something. What that something is what I think some countries are trying to do as much as possible now. But of course, an accelerated process would also be explored. However, on the issue of the solar radiation, of course, it's very controversial at the moment. So not just because of its technical state, it's quite technical for most of our citizens, if you want to call that, and especially in the vulnerable countries, we don't have this capacity to actually even start to understand most of what is being discussed. There are few gray areas as this has not been really tested. And we also have issues of competing priorities for member states. So right now, we've not had that moment where we brought down our leaders and presented this to them and told them this is what is planning to happen and how do we think we should move on. Of course, it's increasing, the need is increasing now. We know that there's an acceleration kind of in terms of the research going on. So we need to do this before we miss the boat. And as I said, we are burdened with, of course, other priorities like combating poverty, access to education, health. And now with the pandemic, I'm not sure how we are going to now introduce a new agenda to kind of get the countries to rally behind this. Of course, there is the issue of multilateralism. So this is where the countries, the vulnerable countries, and especially those from Africa would work on. Then we have, especially for the multilateral environmental agreements, the key question is here, has this really worked for Africa and even for other countries? We've been negotiating on many of these MEAs on climate change, biodiversity, desertification. It looks like the discussions are never ending, and maybe I attend the wrong forums, but I've not seen a place where we are actually sitting there to report great progress on at least these three. So in as much as we'd want to have everyone on the table and focus on these global processes, we need to see how the vulnerable states especially can get more out of this, and how even those processes can be either better coordinated or streamlined, or ensure that there's some kind of enforcement mechanisms embedded in some of these. Otherwise, it continues to be just one more COP where discussions are made and everyone goes home and they put them on the shelves, and then we all discuss on how it really needs to be done after. So, however, of course, this has brought more awareness to the general public, and countries are more aware, and of course, we are taking action. But is this action enough? So there's that challenge. We also have the technological gap. We need solutions which work for states like the vulnerable states, and because we don't have this capacity to conduct this the kind of research we are talking about now. So countries in Africa and also in other states would need to find a way to build the capacity in this particular subject of its own scientists, so that this technology and the new ideas of dealing with the challenges of climate change are also coming from this part of the world, because then they'll be more adapted to the special needs that we have in our continent. But this new research, of course, like all other research, seems to be coming from elsewhere. So the issue of capacity would need to be addressed, and the need to have more African scientists involved in these processes. How the countries would do that is also going to be a little bit of a challenge, because of course we are not going to just send in everyone if we don't have them. So there's that, the issue of technology and the gap in the research field. We also hope that the solar radiation management would not now again slow down the ongoing efforts to combat climate change. There's a lot of pressure on the developed countries to do something and do more, a bit less on the developing ones. So we may have to look at this to ensure that countries are not going to use this as a quick fix to what they have already agreed to in the past, especially in terms of the capacity finance, etc., and mitigation especially. We may be able to address the question on how we may be able to address the associated risks and potential benefits. Of course, we would need to have a common position on this as a continent or as a group of countries that are vulnerable, to see how to better find a coordination or governance mechanism that works best for everyone. And this mechanism could be at the international level, of course, where I think there are more vulnerable states than the non-vulnerable ones. We would also need to have some form of process going on already now at the regional and sub-regional levels to be ready when the time comes, either to deal with the risks as well as the benefits. Some of the risks, we are looking at issues of liability and compensation. Already we are facing challenges with the loss and damage issues right now. So we would need to see how that could be addressed. Of course, the issues of attribution. And then I think my time is up. We would also continue to advocate for multilateralism, and they need to have all the parties at the table in a fair and just manner. I think I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. That was a very cogent, well-articulated points as to what I think the conversation around SRM is actually missing. And I'm most thankful that you've supplied a number of the key insights. And I hope the participants are also paying attention. You know, there's a lot of weight to many of the points that you've made. For instance, the burden of competing priorities. Is this really what should be tackled at the moment? What happens to the other priorities, and so on? We are actually in a very interesting context that's probably most appropriate as well to our discussion, being in a pandemic where a lot of people are almost desperately, not a lot, but some are desperately trying to float the same kind of approaches probably that we're grappling with because of silver bullet thinking. And maybe as the more we think about things in this way, the less we think about the things that we can already do and we must do as well. I want to remind the participants that we have enough time for questions and comments. Please, I encourage all of you to write down your questions or comments on the chat box. It should be in front of you. My colleagues will be taking them down. If there's a lot, they will be sending them to me so I can read them out. And if you have a question in particular to a specific speaker or panelist, please write that down as well, and so that we can take note. I'll be encouraging you after every panelist, just so you don't forget. So our next speaker is Ambuj Garg. I give you now the floor to articulate a little bit more from another angle from your perspective.
Thank you very much, Red. And I just start with thanking the organizers for having me here to contribute to and join this very important discussion. You know, SRM to me is one of these issues that one would wish that one would not have to think about it. But I think as many of the colleagues before me have articulated, we cannot not think about it, since it may very well be required as part of our portfolio of actions to address climate change. So it's one of these things where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Anyway, as I said, I think we have to think about it. And I should also say that I certainly can't offer any answers at this point on how we might move forward. But I do think that we have to have a better understanding of the kind of questions we need to be thinking about. And I will focus on my remarks mostly on that. I want to just start by highlighting, I think, key issue of solar radiation modification that has been highlighted, but I want to just reiterate that SRM is characterized by deep scientific uncertainty, both in terms of its ability to reduce or manage greenhouse warming in a well-controlled and effective manner. And as Janos mentioned, it certainly cannot restore the climate, but even the question of how well it can, how effectively it can control greenhouse warming, I think there's a fair amount of scientific uncertainty there and the possible impacts across geography, societies, and ecosystems of implementation if it is to happen. And therefore, certainly words like management and engineering are misleading because to me at least, because it suggests much more control than we actually have. There also is concern that the mere consideration of SRM may create interest groups that propel SRM forward towards deployment, and I think we have to be cognizant of that. And the fact that the mere existence of SRM as an option may change how we think about mitigation and adaptation and the kind of priority that we allocate to that. And these are what people in academia refer to as both the moral hazard, the slippery slope, and the moral hazard kind of dimensions. In the case of SRM, since we're talking about governance, the governance issues are intimately coupled to the scientific knowledge. This is one of those areas where you cannot think about decision-making without drawing on a deep understanding of the science, especially since this is science that's going to give us some guidance and hopefully reduce uncertainties of how well SRM may work, and if we were to deploy SRM, what might the impacts look like in different, potential impacts may look like in different parts of the world. In some sense, it's a little bit different from other parts of the climate arena, where once we know that climate change is happening and is attributable to humans, it's not a yes-no issue, but only a question of the extent to which we move. SRM, in that sense, I think it's, as I said, becomes a little bit trickier. So from my point of view, I see governance requirements in both engaging with the shaping of the SRM research enterprise. And there are two dimensions of the research enterprise that I will come to in a minute. And also the governance dimensions of the implementation of SRM, if it is to happen, or if we are to think about doing that down the line. So I think the first part of this is thinking the governance aspects of ensuring that SRM discussions do not reduce the emphasis on mitigation and adaptation efforts. And the question is, what might governance arrangements look like that actually prevent SRM from reducing the emphasis on mitigation and adaptation? The second dimension is ensuring that the research on SRM is relevant to the context and circumstances of vulnerable communities and countries. And these are not just those are vulnerable to climate impact. So it kind of changes the terminology of vulnerability. It's not just vulnerable to climate impacts, but also potentially vulnerable to SRM impacts. So as I said, it adds another nuance to the term vulnerable. And making sure when I say research, it's both the scientific research that is thinking about the physical aspects of SRM implementation, or SRM, the physical impact implications, but also the research on the governance side. So because there are actually two streams of research going on, what I would call the natural science research and the governance research, and both of them actually need to be relevant to the context and circumstances of vulnerable countries. Again, the question here becomes, what does relevance mean? Are we thinking about implications of SRM deployment for these countries in terms of impacts? What might the kind of governance arrangements look like? And I think Leah also talked about questions relating to risk. And the third part is ensuring that vulnerable communities and countries are part of the decision-making process. But it's not even clear, as has been mentioned here, who are the decision makers. Are these only states or state-level actors? Or could there be, and people have talked about this and think about this, there may be non-state actors or individuals who may effectively be able to engage in SRM. And how does one think about that dimension of the decision-making process? So I want to just spend 2 or 3 minutes now just talking about what kind of capacity is needed to engage with these questions, because I think fundamentally, as we're thinking about these mix of or dimensions of governance issues, one has to think about what kind of capacity is required in order to engage with this process. The first one I would say is we require the capacity to help shape the research enterprise such that it asks questions relevant to national needs of the needs of these countries and communities, the vulnerable countries and communities. How to do research that is both sensitive to the needs of these groups and also allows meaningful engagement with the publics, with broader communities. We don't really know how to do that well today. And I think this is something we really have to pay a lot of attention to make sure that as we move forward, we have capacity to allow for the engagement of a variety of groups and actors in this process in shaping the research enterprise. We then require capacity to understand the scientific knowledge and its implications pertaining to SRM efficacy and possible impacts. This is really a question of being able to unpack and interpret scientific knowledge in an appropriate way that then could be communicated to policymakers, citizen groups, and civil society and other entities. So this really effectively is building up kind of the scientific capacity. And the last one is the capacity to think through the governance arrangements pertaining to SRM deployment that are fair and sensitive to the situation of vulnerable countries. Under what conditions should we be actually consider SRM deployment? How do we think about the objectives of SRM deployment? Who should control it? How do we understand how well SRM may be working or not? How do we think about managing the risk? I mean, loss and damage may be one way to think about it, but are there other arrangements that we want to think about that may be particularly relevant to developing countries? We need to think about how to strengthen our capacity to coordinate with other countries, develop an understanding of shared interests and implications for solidarity. To my mind, this is a very tricky question because since the SRM of implications may vary widely across countries, could there be a situation in which it might pit vulnerable countries against each other because how SRM plays out for them turns out to be very different? I think that question becomes a very tricky question of how do we, in such a situation, still maintain solidarity and some sense of shared interests. Frankly, actually, I'm talking about capacity to do all of this. Even the question of what that specific capacity is, in which actors and so on, is itself a research question. So I'll stop with that. I think maybe I might have put more questions than answers on the table, but as I said, this is an arena in which I think we're just beginning to engage, and it's important to even think through more systematically about the questions we need to engage with before we get to the answers. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Ambuj, you did perfectly by raising the questions that I think mattered. And I think we'll have enough time to try to not just answer them, but also to add more questions. Those are the questions that I think need to be asked. And I'm glad that this is a forum that actually raises these questions, because these are the perspectives that matter. How does it apply to a country like Bangladesh? We've heard a lot, Mofiz, for instance, of that vulnerable countries have the most to gain. And there are more positive impacts to the global south. And of course, you ask, says who? And what is benefit and what is gain? And have these been evaluated, and have these been assessed against priorities for development of specific countries? Mofiz, please, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Saleem and the Gaveshana team for this wonderful conference. And Gaveshana is very core of my heart, because I have attended all 7 Gaveshana when I was in Bangladesh. So in this 7 minutes, I will spend explaining 2 dimensions. One is my very personal journey for the last 5 years in the context of solar radiation modification or climate geoengineering in general. And the second, my experience with Decimal Grant, which we own 2 years back, in 3 years, 2018. So Decimal was an interesting opportunity for me, early career researcher from Global South, to explore more on SRM and its potential risk on health. So let me start with my personal experience. Here in Germany, I work in a university, but at the same time, I'm also lecturing in a university in India, where our vision is to develop the voice from Global South on climate action, on climate debate. And I also talk a lot with young professionals and youth policy forums and universities in Bangladesh. So there is a difference in views in these 3 different countries, but there are similarities as well. But when we attend lectures in Germany, there are different set of questions from the students. So, I operate mostly student level, so my discussion will be more from the classroom. So students have questions of technical aspects, like in where we have to, like if SRM will be deployed, where it will be, how much it will be, the cost, how efficient it will be, what will be the negative consequences. But it's not hard in German classroom to explain aerosol injections and marine cloud brightening, because this is some sort of understanding is already here. But when I give lecture first time in a Bangladeshi classroom, so immediately I see a lot of fear from the students. So they ask me question like in a country where majority of the population haven't been in the airport, like haven't been taken a flight. So you are talking about injecting aerosol in the stratosphere. Is it something is relevant to us? So that was the question from many Bangladeshi students and young policy forums. Then the question, I see several fears from the student community. Number one is Bangladesh ready for this kind of discussion, or we should be doing what we are good at? For example, Bangladesh is an adaptation-focused country, because adaptation operates in the scale of, in the context of agriculture, water, soil conservation, biodiversity, tree plantation, all those aspects, which we are good at, nature-based solution. So we are historically doing this, and if this kind of discussion comes from adaptation point of view, that people understand better. But when it comes to SRM or marine cloud brightening or carbon capture, direct carbon air capture, and so on and so forth, we are not good at it. We haven't done it. So the popular discussion is, shall Bangladesh continue thinking, discussing, debating on adaptation, or we will go for this? And my personal view is always like, knowledge have no boundary actually, even though we will not be doing this, but there is no harm of discussing it. So we should be bringing this to classroom, we should be bringing this to policy debate and discussion. And personally, I'm not in favor of or opponent of any climate geoengineering, but I'm in favor of more on knowledge perspective. The way we look at is like this kind of solution it developed in Western academic world, and it's traveled to our part of the world. And we don't really own this kind of discussion. Always we feel like this is kind of an external idea is coming or imposing on us. And until and unless we build up our capacity, we understand it, and we have some sort of ownership to the knowledge, then I don't think we'll never kind of go deep into it or appreciate it. So that was my first interest to start reading, learning, and joining global geoengineering community. And I see there are other fairs in the young youth policy level or in student level. There was fair of finance. So because we are still struggling of adaptation finance, because you see there's disparity, mitigation gets more money than adaptation. But if geoengineering kind of thing comes as a technological fix, as a solution, will there be enough money for adaptation? So this kind of discussion I listen from the student community. And when I talk this thing to my Indian students first time, there's a very interesting response, which I have enjoyed a lot, because they are kind of keen of learning of this thing, and one of the dimension is like China have a large geoengineering scheme. They are doing a lot of research. So I see there are kind of geopolitical aspects they are very keen in. They said if China is doing this, and we have to catch up probably, we have to learn, we have to invest on this, because otherwise there is an imbalance in the context of geopolitics of Asia or globally probably. So they're also fear from termination effect, like if we do it for a few years, then we stop it, what will happen? Is it a permanent solution? Or sometimes we discuss that maybe an alliance of small island countries or vulnerable countries can decide to do it. Like it's not that only rich country can think of it, we can also think, how do we perceive this idea? And interestingly, I see there are also tension that because all the small countries are not operating in the same level, maybe don't have similar interest. Also within country there might be different views, because when if SRM or larger scale geoengineering get deployed, so it's not that everybody will get equal benefit. Even within the country, there might be some places have more rainfall, some places have rain. For example, under decimal grant, we are looking at two diseases, malaria and cholera. And when we run our malaria model, we see the result is not equal. The benefit people will gain or the people will lose is not equal. There are differences regionally and differences even in a small scale. So this kind of fair and this kind of discussion, I always listen. And for me, the most interesting thing is like people to people and researcher to researcher level discussion, which is very essential, because of course there are state level discussion, but non-political actors. For example, when we join decimal grant, so there are many countries own the grant. And
please, you'll have to wrap up. Sorry.
Yes, I'm just finishing it. Yeah. So now we are exchanging data, we're exchanging paper, we're writing paper together. So a lot of collaborative effort is going on. And I think this is very vital. And with this, I thank you all. Yeah.
Mafis, thank you very much. I apologize for having to interrupt. It's just important to have that interaction later. And so I turn right away to my good friend, Manuel. You're the principal program officer in your country's environmental protection agency. You've been a steady hand at the climate negotiations, always with Ghana's interest in mind. I wonder what your perspectives would be like on this particular issue. Please, you have the floor. And I hope you can keep to time.
Thank you very much, Red. Honorable members of the panel, facilitators, and distinguished participants. I'm also extremely honored to be part of the panel of this event with support of the CVS Secretariat hosted in the GCA, Netherlands, and the presidency in Bangladesh. Thank you also to the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative for this invitation. As indicated earlier, I'm here to share perspective as a climate specialist from one of the climate vulnerable countries in the CVF in terms of interest in this topic, related policies and recommendations to the governing practices and technologies on the climate change policies of member countries. In relation with potential interests of CVF countries, it is very interesting to see all of the current efforts of researchers, policymakers, and their ideas of developing solar radiation modification. CVS countries look forward to this technology with some interest and some concern also. I believe the CVF members will be interested to study and think further about its potential benefits of reducing the rise of air temperature from climate change, and also hold interest in the sense of potentially preventing many of the associated impacts of climate change in the respective countries. As you know, climate change adaptation has become a major necessity for most of us. And most CVS countries are highly exposed to climate change and variability, and also threatened to climate impact on livelihoods, water resources, food, and energy security. These issues, as you know, are already currently proceeding at a high rate, while global efforts of reducing the climate change impact is actually not sufficient. That said, I think vulnerable countries can equally concern about this type of technology. Some panelists also touched on such points. For instance, will SRM use lead to delay action to cut pollution by major emitting countries? Will its use end up reducing our ability to generate solar power by increasing cloudiness in the atmosphere? Will SML have other harmful consequences, such as on food security, which is a great issue for CVF? Will there be unforeseen changes that we have not yet thought of? From our perspective, we have to be very cautious to do our homework and really investigate and explore this issue of SML carefully. In further exploring this technology from our country perspective, especially stratospheric aerosol injection, it is quite evident that most CVL countries have various gaps in terms of capacity and technology capacities to manage this topic in this nature. Even in areas where some later policies capacity exists, it requires sustainability to maintain its system. Our ability as vulnerable countries to effectively engage in this complex technological topic like SRM will be helped through efforts in areas like education, training, and public awareness, which aim to build capacities. We will look to partner with C2G, who help in this respect. This could be supported by identifying information and understanding gaps and developing recommendations related to SML technologies, exploring how vulnerable countries can input and take more ownership of governance approaches being developed on the issue of SML, since this may affect us a lot, as well as fostering dialogue, coordination, collaboration, and coherence among related processes and initiatives under the Convention, including through exchanging information and capacity building initiatives and strategies of the bodies established under the Convention. As climate change vulnerable countries, to be sure, considering of SML's technology takes account of severe country perspective, we will really need a very consistent engagement by CVF officials in different ongoing debates. It will be important for our countries to have a voice and role in shaping any policy that might permit or inhibit the use of SM-type technology. Finally, we are working hard to demonstrate our commitment to mainstream innovations into national development plans. We also aim to make such innovations consistent to our country's traditional and indigenous beliefs based on existing documentation, research, and earlier studies. We would be good to join hands more broadly across the CVS to influence and shape better policies in areas like this one. Thank you for this opportunity today.
Manuel, thank you very much. That was, of course, enlightening. Let me make two requests from our participants. Continue asking the questions because they're being posed to our panelists. A little bit of request as well to our panelists. It's fine to actually answer in writing in the Q&A that is in front of you, but I also hope that I will be posing the same questions so that others can also see the exchanges, because they are going to be really important. Another thing that I'd like everyone to draw your attention to, there are over 50 participants. There were 60 earlier, but it always goes up and down, but never below 50. It shows that there's a big interest on this particular issue, but it's also not the only one. So if you look at your chat box, I'll also put together the link and I'll share it with you. The time this Saturday, there will be another discussion on geoengineering as still part of Gobeshona, this activity. If you don't know, Gobeshona is Bangla for research. As with a lot of the work that Saleem does, research that is without blinders. We look at what is the motivation, what is the analysis, but also who benefits the most and who wants this mostly. So implications of geoengineering on locally led adaptation actions. There's an Eventbrite invitation. There's a link. I hope you can also go there because a lot more of our civil society colleagues will be speaking. Some of the experts also asked some questions, Net Danyo, and I'll get to their questions later, but we have our last panelist, hopefully gives us an exclamation point, and I won't introduce him further. Mark Linus, please, rock the boat.
Thank you, Red. I shall do my best to endeavour to rock the boat, and if not, sink it entirely. Now, I want to start actually by advertising somebody else's book. As a writer, we're often quite reluctant to do that, but this book here, can you see that? It's called, may appear backwards, I'm not sure, but it's called The Planet Remade by an author, Oliver Morton, who's a writer for The Economist, How Geoengineering Could Change the World. And I was having a look back at this book. It's about a year or so old right now, because in one of the closing chapters, he imagines a scenario where a group of countries, vulnerable countries largely, form a sort of unilateral alliance to carry out solar radiation management using stratospheric aerosol injection. almost as a kind of blackmail threat to the big emitters to say, if you don't cut your emissions and you don't carry out enough mitigation to save our countries from the long-term threat of climate warming, then we're going to geoengineer the climate, because that's the only thing that can save us. So it's a fascinating subject. It's very controversial. I think for a lot of people, even us having this meeting and even talking about it is problematic and a real challenge. So we need to always bear in mind to be quite diplomatic about how we consider this issue. One thing that I think is important to re-emphasize, however, is that we are already geoengineering the climate. We are in the midst now of what is generally recognized to be the Anthropocene, so a new geological epoch, which is named after ourselves, the Homo sapiens. So that's why it's the Anthropocene, because we are now the single largest influence of the Earth system. We talk about stratospheric aerosol injection, but let's not forget that we're already doing tropospheric aerosol injection, SAI or TAI, in fact. We're putting aerosols in the troposphere through burning coal, burning biomass, and these have a substantial cooling effect, probably of as much as 0.5 degree Celsius on an ongoing basis. A lot of that's from the global south, of course, particularly from South Asia and East Asia and China, of course. So if we're to reduce coal burning, to reduce biomass burning, reduce deforestation, actually we will, ironically enough, reduce some of the cooling that's already evident there. So you might make the argument, maybe we should replace some of the cooling that's already going on unintentionally in the troposphere with some cooling which we want to have intentionally in the stratosphere. The book I wrote, which is actually most relevant to this, was called The God Species. I'm not suggesting that we are in any way divine, but that, in the words of Stuart Brand, who's a thinker, an American thinker, he said, we are as gods, so we might as well get good at it. And getting good at it means not just having the science to understand the way the Earth system is being influenced by ourselves, but to decide really how we want the Earth system to evolve in the future. And that's very much under our control. So I'll give you as a thought experiment, I mentioned earlier, I'm advisor to former President Nasheed on the Maldives. The Maldives, of course, is a tropical coral atoll nation. According to the IPCC, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is the difference between roughly 75% loss of coral reefs and 99% loss. So if we don't meet the 1.5 degree target, we go up to 2 degrees, you see the functional eradication of coral reefs as an ecosystem. And that, of course, undermines the long-term viability of coral atoll nations, as does, of course, sea level rise, which could make the difference between the existence and the total disappearance of nations like the Maldives. So President Nasheed could, with great moral force, I think, go to the international community and say, we want SRM because that's going to be the difference between existence and non-existence for our entire nation. So we often counterpose this in a negative sense, but I think you could also look at it in a positive way just as well. I won't go through the science. People have already done that. Yes, we know SRM could work. Technically, the physics is pretty clear. We've seen that with Mount Pinatubo and other volcanic eruptions. The economics is also pretty clear. It's relatively cheap, $2 billion a year or so. It's like a single power station. The real issues, I think, are politics, so governance, morality, issues like the moral hazard, which was already raised, that it could, if done by the big emitters, reduce the pressure on them for mitigation. And the governance challenges really, I think, are insuperable, and this is probably where SRM fails, in that we have to somehow have a process for deciding what the temperature of the planet should be. We already have our sweaty fingers on the planetary thermostat to a significant extent, but we actually would be in a position of having to decide what the average temperature of the planet should be, because we'd be turning it up or down according to how much aerosol we put into the stratosphere. And that, of course, would raise its own kinds of loss and damage questions. Who would pay for the damages which might be caused by some of the unanticipated impacts? Whose drought might this be? However, I think we should bear in mind that the science is never going to be completely clear here. So with SRM impacts, you will never be able to be sure what would have happened otherwise had you not interfered with the planetary ecosystem in this way. It's a bit like climate attribution studies, where you can never say that this single hurricane is directly attributable to climate warming. And in that same way, no single drought or flood event will ever be directly attributable to SRM. So, people in this session already, people have said we will want answers, but we need to recognize there will never be answers which don't come without a very large degree of uncertainty attached to them. So we will have to, if we ever do carry out this experiment, do so under conditions of structural uncertainty, which will never go away. We'll never know for sure what would have happened had we not done SRM if we decide to carry it out. And I think the morality issues are also really clear in terms of the challenges that they raise, certainly not the answers that we might decide to come to. We would be accepting that this is now going to be a human-made planet forever. That we would absolutely be the God species if we do this kind of geoengineering. We'd be changing the color of the sky. We'd be deciding on what kinds of weather patterns we're going to see. We would be intruding on one of the major biogeochemical cycles, which around which the Earth system functions. From the perspective of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, I think it's premature for us to get overly involved in the SRM debate. Largely from the moral hazard perspective, I think it's really important, obviously crucial at this point, that we don't begin to make it look as if we're letting go of the 1.5 degree Paris goal, which CVF nations fought so hard for. Particularly at the time that we find ourselves in, 2020, I think, was a tipping point for climate ambition and mitigation to a substantial extent. We've now got net zero targets from some of the world's largest emitters, China, hopefully the US later on today, the European Union, of course, South Korea, Japan. This is a very different world from the one that I remember back in Copenhagen in 2009 when I first started working with President Nasheed, when it was unthinkable to even hazard the suggestion that China should undergo any form of substantial mitigation. And if you look at the latest Climate Action Tracker report, they say that we're within striking distance of the 1.5 degree goal. So this is not the time to let that go by thinking of enormous experiments like SRM. Even more so, I think, given the latest science, which suggests that if we do take emissions to zero, the warming trend actually would reduce very quickly. I think perhaps one of the justifications for solar radiation management might be that if it was already too late, so that we were to do a huge amount of mitigation, but the planet would continue to warm and there would be nothing that we would be able to do about that. I don't think that's the case. So I think mitigation absolutely will work. And if we get to net zero as a planet by 2050, we will still be able to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. Just to finish up, let's recall, however, there will always be trade-offs. For example, a lot of people live in an imaginary world where renewables can do the entirety of the mitigation that we need. I think that's not going to happen. So you might have to decide, let's just say as another provocative thought experiment, to decide between solar radiation management and a huge deployment of nuclear power for achieving net zero. So all of these things, I think, are issues which the CVF is going to have to grapple with. And I think if we don't, somebody else will. And what's most important of all is that the voices of developing countries, vulnerable countries in the global south become a much bigger part of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for keeping to time. We have some time left. Let me read some of the questions and some of the answers already so that we don't have to go through them entirely. There's a question from Jennifer Ernst on the problem of capacities for research in vulnerable countries. Would a cooperational research program with participating scientists from different vulnerable countries be an option to cope with the capacity problem? Ambuj has answered that and said, yes, I do think we need to do that since there is a whole host of questions and capacity in most countries, which is very limited. But such efforts need to be led by vulnerable countries. Of course, I agree with that completely. Led, of course, is the key word there, not any other word. Another one, Nameless, asked, if C2G as co-organizer of the session is impartial and enabling deliberations, Why is it that there's no one in this panel from civil society and grassroots movements to present critical perspectives and campaigning against SRM and geoengineering? Janos answered by saying the purpose of the session was to learn more about the issues than to have a debate for or against SRM. I'd also like to say that I'm not from government. I think C2G is neither from government. Saleem certainly is not as well, and Mark also. I also think that there's a lot of arguments that were made actually in different ways that may not be spelled out as campaigning against, but raises very fundamental questions that I think are not only not answered at the moment, it comes very late in terms of asking the vulnerable countries who are often the recipient of impacts that Mark had described earlier as geoengineered to begin with, and are now being offered another set of geoengineering solutions, which comes also very late. And so these are really important questions to ask because this is not this is neither an easy issue to tackle, but also it's not so complicated that we can't see the fundamental ethical considerations that I think require early engagement. There's another question that asks, Janos, what is your basis in saying that research is conducted with support from decimal of SRM so far in the Global South? Has led you to say there's more positive impacts. If you're impartial, isn't that statement too partial and too dangerous based on modeling studies done in a few countries in the South? Janos answered that this is based on published research and that there are also papers on SRM impacts on sub-Saharan Africa, and that this is not C2G's view, but only reported by research. I would actually be partial to the question answer, the one asking the question, because I think it's even more important, just as we're saying we have to define what you mean by geoengineering when you use it, we also cannot simply say that there are more positive impacts for the Global South and assume that that is going to be applicable to all, which is what the implication is. So this exchange actually helps a lot, but I also caution, I did spot also, that the earlier statement that the Global South appears to have the most to gain and the most to lose. The most to lose is very much proven in terms of experience thus far. The most to gain, that's a very big question, even bigger, including more positive impacts, because it tends to skew the discussion a little bit more. Let me ask at this point, Leah, and also Ambuj, why is justice and equity so important in this discussion? And to cut time short as well, let me ask Emmanuel and Mark also the question of, if this is going to be a debate and it's not necessarily going to have to be the priority of vulnerable countries, what is the forum, where is the forum to discuss this in? Because a lot of these discussions is happening outside of UNFCCC. Is this something that should be discussed in an arena where countries do have an equal say and would have a means by which we can manage whatever approach that we can make here? But first, Leah, could you give us a response very quickly and followed by Ambuj?
Thank you. I think the question of justice and equity is not just important in this, but in everything we do, because the most vulnerable groups are always impacted. And so it's not a question of how important, it's a question of how do we ensure that it's done in a right way, because most of the time the people who are, the action is taken on, like those impacted on, are not at the discussion table. So we need to hear their voices, we need to ensure that they are represented, we need to ensure that their needs are taken care of. Otherwise it will be this continuous cycle of receiving technologies and solutions which are not a fit for the local consumption, I think. But of course it's a key issue.
Thank you very much, Leah. Ambuj, would you care to give your quick take on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, I agree with Leah, and that justice and equity are always important. I think in this SRM case, they become particularly important because SRM, as I mentioned, I think raises a lot of distributional questions, that the distribution of impacts and its implications across countries, and also in terms of ability to participate in the decisions about research and decisions about governance arrangements and eventually decisions about deployment if it ever gets to that. And I think so to me, the justice and equity dimensions again become highlighted just in terms of ensuring that if it is going to further complicate or add nuances as to who's marginalized in these conversations and how vulnerability is changing, we need to be particularly sensitive to the fact that as we move forward, we are thinking about groups and actors that may not have a voice or may not have appropriate representation in the discussion. So it's to say that while justice and equity are always important, this I think SRM raises additional questions relating to ensuring that we are paying adequate attention to justice and equity dimensions.
Thank you very much, Ambuj. Mark and Manuel, as you both articulated, this is an important topic, even though in the scheme of priorities, it may not necessarily be the thing that we dive into the most as far as CVF is concerned. But what is when it comes to a question of arena and sway and irrational discussion that allows the prioritization of those who are hit the most by this crisis, how would you tackle that? What would be your notion of proper arenas and where voices that will be impacted or may gain the most would have the most weight? Mark, can we start with you as the last speaker, and then I'll ask you, Emmanuel.
My hunch is that it should be the UNFCCC. That's, after all, the sort of UN convention which is in charge of governing the climate, and which is probably going to be in the best position to answer the question of what the planet's temperature should be, and how we get there. We can get there either by mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, or we could conceivably get there also by reducing the amount of solar radiation that comes into the planet. So you might argue that there are two ways of achieving roughly the same thing, although we know very well that they're not completely equivalent. And the UNFCCC, I think, is better than anything else I can think of in terms of the ways in which civil society can participate, and smaller and vulnerable countries can have a reasonable chance of having their voices heard through the way that the UN systems generally work. You'd probably need a new protocol. I think it would need to have an element of legal bindingness to try to ensure that you didn't have unilateral actors directly putting aerosols into the stratosphere. So but I don't think it's a discussion which needs to be opened up right now, as I said earlier.
Except that your main point earlier was that there will be trade-offs, and we need to deal with them as early as we can, because there will be a lot of and hard decisions that need to be made. Okay, thank you. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to touch on whether we need to discuss it at the UNFCCC negotiations, and I say yes, because looking at the technical nature of this topic, and you all know it is also very new to us, and going into the research is being driven by the research of different countries, and because of that, awareness is very low. So it's very, very important that the negotiations, especially currently we are moving on the Doha work program, it's better to discuss this at that level so that it will fall into the local policies. And then we'll be able to use it locally, and then we head our voice, and then it will enter into the local policies, and then implementation becomes effective. So this is what I would like to add for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. There are a couple of questions more that have cropped up. From Aziz, wouldn't SRM go against the interests of most people in the global south and less in developed nations? He also added that it seems SRM is untested and possibly untestable on the scale that it will be required, and is too risky for the living earth. We have some, our countries, I'm from the Philippines, our countries are very different, Mofis, but also we have a lot of similarities. And one of these similarities is something that I asked Mark also earlier, because there will be trade-offs. And in a sense, we are grappling as well, because we do have development priorities. And we all agree that climate change is bigger than everything else. But in our specific context, it's also not necessarily the most important, because we do have poverty, agriculture, food, shelter, and jobs, to deal with. And these are all just as important. What is your take on what SRM might bring in terms of its impacts to agriculture, to food, and what might work potentially in one specific area in the global south doesn't mean it will work in Bangladesh or others. Have you given this some thought?
Oh, thank you very much. The answer would be we don't know many things yet. For example, SRM's potential impact on health. There was no study in the past. So even the context of climate change and health is new. So we are doing research on climate change and its impact on health, trying to understand the relationship. But in addition, SRM is way too far to conclude this moment or make any comment, So there are some studies looking at SRM on agriculture, SRM on biodiversity, and so on and so forth. But the studies are very limited. So this moment, the argument I would make is we should be doing research to understand it more clearly before making any comment or conclusion.
Mafiz, thank you. That's very clear. Let me read some of the other questions and comments to the panel from Christian Zauner. What are your thoughts and insights regarding ground-based SRM, like this one with floating mirrors? And from Klaus Radunsky, if you look at the chat, it's a little long, but he also shares a little bit more information on other aspects of SRM and experience of others as well. We are running close to our closing. It's 6:53 p.m. We will make every minute count, of course. So let me again draw you to the discussion that will take place on Saturday. If you still want more, there's a number of eminent people who will be discussing this issue at greater length, in particular the implications to local adaptation activities. I guess we need to also understand very much, one of the questions from Chloe is whether international law could provide a valuable framework for vulnerable countries to make their voices heard. Is bringing these debates to the courts a potentially valuable option? Ambuj, you were typing your answer earlier, but maybe you'd like to weigh in. And if I can ask Leah as well, for African policymakers, should SRM be high on their agenda, or would you also take the option that that Mofiz was recommending, which is we still really do not know much about this, and before we move forward, let's find out more. Ambuj and then Leah.
I have to say, I was thinking about the answer to this. Honestly, I'm not an international law expert, but I think it's an important question that I think it's certainly worth some thinking as to what might be the role of international law in relationship to SRM, and also in terms of thinking about even international governance arrangements. I mean, whether Mark said that UNFCCC, that this issue belongs in the UNFCCC, and I think it's true that UNFCCC cannot be not cognizant of the conversations that are going on here. But again, as I said, this is not my area of expertise, but the question I think really becomes whether this issue is best governed under the UNFCCC, or whether it really should be governed under a different kind of an international legal architecture. As I said, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is certainly something worthy of international legal scholars to be thinking about, because in the end, this is a question that probably will be quite thorny legally, and it's probably not too early for these legal scholars to start engaging with this question. I don't know what direction it might go in, but I think certainly deeper engagement would be very desirable.
Thank you, Ambuj. Leah?
Thank you. And I think I'd seen also Mark's hand was up. I don't know if it was an old hand. Should this be high on the agenda of the African policymakers? Yes. Why? Because we are also the continent that is suffering the most from the impacts of climate change now. So, but also because we do not want to wait until research has been done, and then we are kind of playing catch up, as is the case. We are always running after the technology, trying to build our capacity from somewhere else. So I think it's high time that the African leadership and policymakers take lead in this and also be part of the process moving forward, because it's really difficult when we try to play catch up all the time and have to kind of ask for resources to train our researchers to do that. So if we catch and join the bus already now, as opposed to waiting, that would be good. Because by the time we know, or we will think we'll know, it will be too late. Everyone will have been knowing more than all of at least us from our side. So my proposal at this point is to jump on the boat quickly and get ahead of this game before we play catch up later. Yeah.
Understand.
And on the political processes, I don't know how we separate them, because I know the UNFCCC process is as much political as it is scientific. So putting it in such processes has that risk where countries are playing geopolitics and not necessarily taking care of the needs of the local communities back at home. So many countries will be drawn to support a country X because of particular reasons, maybe trade agreements and things. So there are all these strings always attached in these political processes, and also the economics of everything. So some of these intergovernmental processes are not very neat, and they have these gray areas that are usually exploited, mainly to the detriment of the vulnerable states who do not have this research. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. It's funny you mentioned, you asked whether Mark was an old hand or not. He is an old hand, I think. But I wonder if you wanted to respond to the question on floating mirrors, or was it another? Mark?
Well, actually, my response was about from an earlier questioner who mentioned about the impacts of SRM being worse than the global south. I don't think that follows logically at all. If the impacts of climate warming are worse on the global south, which I think is supportable, then the impacts of reducing climate warming won't necessarily be also worst on the global south. So as a thought experiment, I think it's completely conceivable that the global south will be more likely to benefit from SRM, not least because the warming impacts are going to be the greatest in subtropical and tropical countries. I mean, if we get to 3-4 degrees, large areas of the world become uninhabitable, including South and East Asia, simply because it's too hot. If we do SRM, then there's conceivably Russia and Canada become too cold. Who knows? So I don't think the distribution of benefits and risks are necessarily always going to be against the interests of global south countries. And that affects a lot of in terms of how we think about this.
Thank you, Mark. It's 7 p.m. In my time, but which is also means that in the rest of the time zones, we've filled our two hours. time flies very quickly when we're having a good discussion. I won't bother to thank our colleagues with Carnegie and C2G and CVF, especially our good friend Dr. Saleem, for organizing this panel. May it not be the last. Certainly, there's another discussion on Saturday, but this one with CVF as well is very important. As Leah had said earlier, it's important to understand as early as we can and get enough information as we can early so that others don't make decisions for us. This is, as Janos had also said earlier, it's not about necessarily for or against, but about catching up with a debate that I think will impact vulnerable countries a lot, whether positively or negatively. That's part of the discussion, and I'm not a panelist here. I'm just trying to get as much from everyone as we can. I hope you have more questions. As Ambuj had said earlier, he asked too much. I think that's not enough. We need to keep asking more, because in the end, we all know that there will be trade-offs. We need to understand what we're trading off and what we're getting in return, because decisions will have to be made in increasingly urgent ways. So on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank everyone for this very fruitful discussion. I wonder if there will be greater interest. This conference goes on for several more days. The links were provided as well. I urge everyone to keep to all the conference discussions, and I thank everyone on behalf of the Expert Advisors Group of EAG, of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and the organizers. Thank you for being very engaged, and keep asking those questions. We should be finding out more and more so that we can make decisions far earlier instead of others making them for us. Thank you very much.